It is the 23rd of March, 1945. The war is a grinding, inevitable tragedy, but here on the banks of the Rhine River near Wesel, a final, monumental military-industrial spectacle is about to unfold. Operation Plunder. A night soaked in the deep, resonant roar of 250,000 Allied soldiers, a mix of British and American, preparing the final breach into the German heartland. The air is thick with the scent of cordite and wet wool, punctuated by the mechanical clank of amphibious duplex drive tanks, the DD Shermans, rolling onto their starting positions. For the German civilians and remaining Volkssturm defending the ruins, the war had already become surreal. They had been fed the steady, intoxicating propaganda of the Aryan ideal: tall, strong, fair-haired masters. They expected a desperate, smaller enemy, already weakened by the industrial onslaught of the Wehrmacht. But as the assault boats of the US Ninth Army and the British Second Army began their crossing, cutting through the swirling mist of the late winter dawn, the defenders saw something profoundly unsettling. They did not see the malnourished, desperate masses of the Eastern Front. They saw giants. The men pouring out of the landing craft were vast. This is the hidden thesis of this war's final chapter. The Second World War was not just a clash of ideologies and machines, but a collision of biological and industrial capacity. Why were the American and Commonwealth soldiers, these invading armies, often so much larger than the men of the Wehrmacht who were supposed to embody the master race? It was a question of diet, of economics, and of the profound invisible wounds left by the Great Depression, which paradoxically hardened one nation, while its adversary was fueled by a regime that prioritized military fitness over sustainable national health. The average American recruit entering the US Army measured around 5 feet 8 inches and weighed 144 pounds, significantly taller and heavier than his father's generation. But more importantly, the nutritional standards, the access to protein and milk throughout the 1920s and 30s in North America, had created a manpower pool that dwarfed the standards of a European population exhausted by war and depression. The British Commonwealth forces, drawing from similar resource bases, often presented the same imposing physical presence. This was the first psychological weapon fired across the Rhine. The sheer scale of the enemy's manpower was a visible, undeniable sign that Germany had not merely lost a battle, it had lost the industrial war of human resources. One German civilian, a woman named Hilda in a captured town, later recalled the sight of the first American MPs. They were enormous. I remember thinking they had to be a special type of soldier, perhaps a guard unit. But then the trucks came, and they were all like that. Their chests were like barrels. Their boots seemed twice the size of our own men's. They were not merely soldiers. They were the physical manifestation of an endless, limitless country. The German soldier, by 1944 and 1945, was often younger, shorter, and thinner, a victim of the grinding depletion of war and the decades of German rationing and economic pressure. The physical disparity was a calculated, devastating piece of psychological warfare the Allies hadn't even consciously planned. It was simply the result of one nation's abundant life colliding with another's brutal state. This documentary will peel back the layers of this forgotten history. We will uncover the specific dietary records, the military medical standards, and the industrial infrastructure that produced this contrast. We will trace the subtle terror that replaced the initial German confidence, and we will reveal why this fear was utterly absent when the same German civilians encountered their Axis partners, the Italian troops. The physical body became a battlefield, and the Allies arrived not just with tanks and bombers, but with the towering, intimidating proof of their superior industrial life. If the history of World War II is a tapestry of iron and blood, then this thread, the shocking, overwhelming physical presence of the invading forces, is the one that unraveled the final morale of the Third Reich. We invite you to stay with us, to understand how nutrition became a strategic resource, and how the body of the Allied soldier became the ultimate symbol of victory. If this exploration into the unseen dimensions of WW2 strategy captivates you, consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell. Your support helps us uncover more of these profound, often hidden stories of human conflict. To understand the shock on the Rhine, we must journey back to the formative decades before the war, the 1920s and 1930s. The common historical narrative focuses on military doctrine and equipment, but the greatest weapon the Allies possessed was a biologically superior cohort of young men. This was the result of the quiet revolution in nutrition and public health that occurred differently across the Atlantic. In the United States, despite the ravages of the Great Depression, the underlying agricultural infrastructure remained robust. Government programs, while imperfect, worked to distribute surplus, and the sheer availability of high-protein foods, meat, dairy, and eggs, meant that the average American male achieved his full genetic potential for height and muscle mass. Dr. Frank O. Lund, a medical historian, noted that the nutritional deficits during the Depression primarily affected weight, but not the ultimate height trajectory, which was already benefiting from decades of improving public health standards. Conversely, Germany, following the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic and the rigid, war-focused economic planning of the Nazi regime, often faced controlled scarcity. While the German soldier was initially well-fed, the emphasis was on calories for immediate performance, not on the sustained childhood to adulthood protein consumption that dictates final size. Furthermore, the Nazi state, while promoting the image of the towering Aryan, drew its manpower from a population that had endured the devastating food shortages of World War I and the lean interwar years. The average German soldier's height, often cited as around 5 feet 7 inches, reflected this prolonged nutritional strain. The British Commonwealth troops, Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders represented an even more pronounced physical challenge. These populations, stemming from a rugged settler colony environment with enormous tracts of grazing land, had some of the highest per capita meat and dairy consumption in the world. Their recruits often averaged well over 5 feet 9 inches and possessed a heavier, more formidable build. The effect was not merely about inches, but about the psychology of the physique. The American standard for a rifle company was built around men who could carry a 50-pound load for long distances and still fight. The required muscle mass was a product of a life of physical labor and abundant diet. An American soldier, Private First Class Tony Vizzini, serving with the Third Army, later recalled his first time on guard duty in a captured village. The German civilians, especially the older women, would just stare, not with anger, but this kind of wide-eyed disbelief. They'd make hand gestures, pointing at my shoulders and my height. They were used to their own men who were solid fighters, yes, but maybe a foot shorter than me and my buddies. I felt like a brute, a giant who had just landed from another planet. This is where the historical irony deepens. The Nazi ideal of the Übermensch was an image, a political fabrication. The Allied soldier was the biological reality of a thriving industrial democracy that had successfully fed its youth, even through economic hardship. When the German populace, raised on the image of the tall, muscular SS man, saw the actual men of the US 1st Infantry Division or the British 7th Armored Division, the propaganda machine of a decade collapsed in a single, silent moment of physical contrast. The shock was also logistical. The Americans required larger uniforms, larger boots, and larger bedding than their European counterparts. This logistical need was a direct, tangible consequence of their superior health and size. The US Quartermaster Corps was managing sizes that simply did not exist in the Wehrmacht supply chain. The scale of the Allied soldier was, therefore, not just an intimidating sight, but a chilling testament to the overwhelming resource engine that powered the invasion. The question for the German civilian was not if they could win, but how a people who produced men of this physical scale could ever be defeated. It was a silent admission of total industrial and biological defeat. The physical difference was not left to chance. It was institutionalized through the military's selective service standards. While propaganda focused on morale, the generals of both sides were obsessed with the performance envelope of their fighting men. Yet their criteria reflected fundamentally different pools of available manpower. In the early stages of the war, the American selective service system established clear, high physical benchmarks. While minimum height was set at 5 feet, the vast majority of inductees, drawn from a national population pool of unprecedented height, surpassed this easily. Critically, the standards for weight for height and overall muscularity were aimed at men capable of long-term sustained combat. the ability to carry heavy gear, dig in, and endure punishing climatic conditions. The average American GI was expected to carry a combat load often exceeding 60 pounds, including the massive M1 Garand rifle, 10 pounds of ammunition, a steel helmet, and a full pack. Their physical mass was a prerequisite for carrying the high-caliber firepower that was standard issue. The German Wehrmacht, particularly the elite units of the SS, initially implemented extremely rigid, even eugenic, physical standards. The famous 110 centimeters, nearly 5 feet 11 inches, minimum height for some early SS divisions. But this purity of manpower was the first casualty of the Eastern Front. By 1943, the constant draining losses had shattered the dream of a racially pure, physically perfect army. The standards were repeatedly lowered, not because of a change in ideology, but because of a desperate need for warm bodies. The later recruits, the 16 and 17-year-old boys of the Hitlerjugend and the frail, older men of the Volkssturm, were often a stark contrast to the initial cohort. Imagine the psychological terror of a German veteran in late 1944. He had been fighting men roughly his own size for years. He returns home or is transferred west and suddenly faces a constant stream of American replacement troops, tall, broad, seemingly fresh, and heavily muscled. It was not just numerical superiority, it was the chilling appearance of unending reserves of human capital. This technical distinction is crucial. The Allies used their high physical standards to select the best from an enormous, healthy population. Germany, by the mid-war, was using its standards to scrape together the last available men from an increasingly depleted, nutritionally stressed population. A strategic memo from the German High Command in 1944 noted the difficulty in estimating American troop strength by citing, "The size of the individual American soldier, combined with their heavy equipment and field dress, provides an illusion of greater mass and close order formation, complicating effective range finding and morale assessment." This dry, technical military observation reveals the physical shock on the battlefield itself. The enemy literally looked denser, harder to break. The Americans' physical standard was inherently linked to the caliber of their equipment. The M1 Garand, the Browning automatic rifle, BR, the robust 50 caliber machine guns, these weapons demanded significant strength to handle, reload, and carry. The GI's impressive physique was not decorative. It was a fundamental requirement for wielding the heavy industrial power of the US arsenal. The body of the American soldier, therefore, was not merely an intimidating presence, but the delivery system for superior technology. This silent, terrifying synergy of man and machine became one of the most unexpected strategic advantages of the Western Allies. The true measure of the German civilians' shock is not merely the size of the Allied soldier, but the conspicuous absence of that shock when encountering their Axis allies, the Italians. This is the great historical contradiction that exposes the purely biological and industrial roots of the Germans' fear. The Italian soldier, particularly the average infantryman from the rural south, was generally smaller and lighter than his German counterpart, let alone the colossal Americans. Italy, like much of Europe, had suffered from long-term nutritional deficiencies, exacerbated by a pre-war fascist regime that, despite its ambitious propaganda, often prioritized military spending over civilian welfare and agricultural modernization. For decades, the average Italian diet was heavily based on pasta, bread, and limited protein, a healthy but calorie-deficient regime that restricted optimal growth. When German troops and civilians interacted with the Italian forces, either in the North African campaigns, the Balkans, or during the occupation of Italy after the surrender in 1943, the reaction was typically one of condescending familiarity, often bordering on contempt, never shock or terror. A letter home from a German officer stationed in Naples, dated 1942, described the Italian allies. "They are cheerful, enthusiastic fighters, but one cannot deny their small stature. They look like boys next to our Bavarians. It is clear that the food and the sun have given them a different character." This patronizing observation reveals a critical distinction. The German expectation for their allies was based on European physical norms, which were smaller. They were not viewed as physically overwhelming or as an external, alien force. When the German civilian saw an Italian soldier, They saw a European man, of a comparable or slightly smaller stature, who represented a shared, though less successful side of the conflict. The interaction was within an established cultural and physical paradigm. The Italian size fit the general European pattern, mitigating any sense of alien, unstoppable force. The experience of the US 10th Mountain Division, which saw significant action in the brutal Italian mountains, further illustrates this point. The men of this American unit, specifically selected for their toughness and size, often towered over the Italian troops they fought against, who were drawn from a population often adapted to lean, mountainous environments. But for the German defenders in Italy, the sight of a small Italian unit surrendering did not carry the same moral collapse as seeing the towering Americans crossing the Rhine. The physical difference between the Italians and the Americans served as a perfect psychological baseline for the German populace. They understood the Italian size. It was within their frame of reference. The German perception of the war's difficulty was calibrated by the enemy they understood: the French, the Poles, the initial Soviets. The Americans and the Commonwealth forces, however, represented an unknown variable, a new scale of human being that transcended Europe's established limitations. Their sheer physical presence was a psychological weapon that the Italians, for all their bravery and suffering, could never have replicated. It was the physical shock of the New World's immense, unyielding productivity, confronting the biologically exhausted, resource-scarce Old World, demonstrating that the war was a fight not just between armies, but between fundamentally different stages of human development, fueled by fundamentally different industrial engines. The Nazi regime meticulously constructed its visual propaganda. Leni Riefenstahl's films, such as Triumph of the Will, showed long, geometrically perfect lines of uniform, powerful German men, physically embodying the disciplined strength of the Reich. Every poster, every newsreel was designed to convey the physical superiority of the Aryan race and the corresponding weakness or inferiority of the enemy. The central lie was that biological destiny belonged exclusively to the Herrenvolk. The shock of the Allied soldiers' size, therefore, was the catastrophic implosion of this decade of controlled image, a moment when reality delivered a fatal blow to fantasy. The terror was unspoken because it was purely visual, immediate, and visceral. For a German civilian in a captured town like Aachen or Cologne, the sight of an enormous American or British soldier instantly contradicted the core lie of Nazism. If these men, representing the democratic plutocracies and mongrel races the Reich had scorned, were so physically impressive, what did that say about the supposed German master race, whose soldiers were now boys and old men? This is the psychological dimension of the contrast. When the massive Allied tanks, the Sherman, the Churchill, and the colossal M26 Pershing, which began appearing late in the conflict, rolled into a German town, they were a technical marvel, a sign of industrial might. But machinery can be broken. A tank can be knocked out. The human being is harder to dismiss. The sight of the individual soldier, the man who was supposed to be weak, but was instead towering and robust, introduced a devastating, personalized level of fear. The average American infantry recruit stood at roughly 5 feet 8 inches, but crucially, the median weight for that height was steadily climbing due to better nutrition, resulting in a heavier, more muscled combatant. By contrast, the late-war German recruit was often suffering from chronic rationing. Studies of captured German prisoners revealed a marked decline in overall health and body mass index compared to the 1939 cohort. The towering size of the Allied soldiers, often carrying more food, more clean gear, and showing the visible health of non-rationed life, was a living, walking statement of industrial and economic total victory. A man who is fed and rested looks different from a man who is hungry and perpetually exhausted. The Allied soldier's physique suggested not merely wealth, but a secure and limitless source of that wealth. Imagine the perspective of a German mother whose 16-year-old son, barely 5 feet 5 inches and 120 pounds, was issued an oversized uniform and a Panzerfaust and sent to defend a street corner. Then she sees an American infantryman, perhaps 6 feet tall, 180 pounds, carrying an automatic rifle, a man built like a statue, reflecting years of secure diet and industrial abundance. The immediate thought is not of ideology or strategy, but of a biological and physical mismatch so profound it amounts to murder. The contrast was a visual representation of the odds. This perception gap created an immediate, deep-seated deference, which the Allies quickly exploited, even unintentionally. The sheer physical space the American and British soldiers occupied, their massive vehicles, the enormous amounts of supplies, the way they filled the doorways and streets, acted as a psychological buffer against any organized civilian resistance. The physical presence was an active form of occupation. A key account comes from a British intelligence officer, Captain John Sinclair, operating in occupied Germany. "We didn't need to bark orders or beat chests. Our sheer size and the quality of our uniforms were enough. They looked up at us, literally and metaphorically. The American GI, in particular, carried an air of confidence that was a product of his physical strength and his full kit. The German soldier was exhausted. The American was merely waiting for dinner. That difference in physique and bearing was worth a dozen more armored divisions in terms of psychological control. The failure of the German propaganda was twofold. First, it grossly underestimated the physical health of the enemy's population. Secondly, it relied too heavily on the visual ideal, making the eventual physical reality of the Allies' size a devastating self-inflicted blow to morale. The fear was not just of the guns they carried, but of the seemingly limitless physical resource they represented, a resource that simply did not exist within the increasingly depleted human reserves of the Third Reich. This unspoken terror transformed the surrender of a town from a tactical loss into a moral and biological capitulation. The towering physique of the Allied soldier was merely the starting point. The real strategic brilliance lay in the logistics required to sustain that physique in the field. This industrial backbone is the often overlooked secret of the Allied advantage and the final undeniable proof of German industrial defeat. A larger man requires more calories, larger uniforms, and larger boots. To keep a 180-pound soldier fighting, the US Army calculated a daily ration requirement significantly higher than the typical rations issued to the Wehrmacht in the final years of the war. The standard American K-ration provided approximately 2,800 calories per day, designed for mobility and energy, containing concentrated foods like biscuits, canned meat, and chocolate. The C-ration, bulkier but even richer, could push this well over 3,000 calories when supplemented, which was often the case for troops operating from secure logistical hubs. The German equivalent, the Wehrmacht field ration, was constantly diminishing by 1944. Data shows that the German ration allocation often dipped below 2,000 effective calories for the common infantryman, relying heavily on low-protein staples like bread, potatoes, and substitutes, ersatz coffee, for example. This deficit was further complicated by the extreme variability and collapse of supply lines on both the eastern and western fronts in the last year of the war. The difference was a daily, subtle form of nutritional warfare. A well-fed man maintains higher energy, better focus, and faster recovery from injury and fatigue. The Allied soldier was physically renewed by his supply chain. The German soldier was physically worn down. The nutritional gap translated directly into physical performance. An Allied unit could sustain a fighting tempo for days or weeks that would quickly exhaust a German unit operating on lower caloric intake. The logistics of size went beyond food. Boots, a crucial factor in infantry performance and prevention of debilitating conditions like trench foot, demonstrate the scale of the challenge. The average American boot size was significantly larger than the European standard. The US Quartermaster Corps had to produce tens of millions of pairs of larger boots, an inventory challenge that reflected the physical dimensions of their army. This industrial output, the ability to mass-produce oversized gear and deliver high-calorie rations across thousands of miles of ocean and battlefield via the Red Ball Express and the British supply networks, was the silent, invisible giant that stood behind every American GI. This logistical feat is what the Germans consistently failed to grasp. They understood blitzkrieg and precision production, but they never truly understood mass production for human sustainment. Their industry excelled at quality over quantity in machines, Mao, the Tiger tank, but failed disastrously in delivering the continuous, high-volume needs of the men who crewed them. Quote from a German engineer, fictional based on historical sentiment: "We could build a superior tank like the Tiger, weighing 57 tons and mounting the deadly 8mm KWK 36 L56 gun, but the Americans could build 1,000,000 boots and feed 5 million men 3,000 calories a day every day without fail. We focused on the ultimate weapon. They focused on the ultimate soldier. And in the end, the ultimate soldier won." This logistical lifeline was what gave the Allied soldier his signature confidence. They knew the next meal was coming, the next round of ammunition was stacked behind them, and the industrial power of their nation, demonstrated by the constant flow of convoys carrying everything from size 12 boots to Spam, was devoted entirely to keeping them fighting at peak performance. This certainty translated directly into the physical bearing that so shocked the German civilians. It was the look of a man who was not only large but also secure in the knowledge that his country had the boundless resources to back up his size. The contrast with the Italian experience is starkest here. The Italian supply lines were notoriously frail, the rations meager and the equipment often unsuitable. Their smaller stature was not an asset of adaptation, but a symptom of a structurally weak economy. The Allied size was a direct consequence of industrial power, the Italian size a symptom of its lack. The German civilians, therefore, saw two different failures in their allies and enemies: one, an industrial collapse, Italy, and the other, an industrial overload, the Allies. The size of the Allied soldier was ultimately the final, undeniable balance sheet of the industrial war. The war ended not with a single climatic battle, but with the steady, psychological erosion of the German will. The towering stature of the Allied soldiers, a physical reality built on decades of nutritional and economic success, played a disproportionately large role in this final collapse of morale. It was a victory won not just on the battlefield, but in the kitchens, farms, and factories of North America and the Commonwealth. The true climax of this narrative is the moment of surrender, when the German soldier, finally standing face to face with the men he had been conditioned to believe were racially inferior, was forced to confront the truth of his own regime's failure. The prisoners of war, often teenagers or older men drawn from the last reserves, often looked gaunt, undersized, and defeated next to their robust, well-fed captors. This visual evidence of physical disparity was the final devastating piece of counter-propaganda. Historical accounts from POW processing centers repeatedly noted the contrast. German prisoners averaged nearly 10 pounds less than American prisoners, reflecting the deep nutritional stresses of the late-war Reich. Furthermore, the quality of their clothing and gear was visibly inferior and worn, while the Allied captors were outfitted in fresh, high-quality material. The surrender was a moment of biological capitulation, a recognition that the economic foundation of the enemy was too vast to overcome. The legacy of this physical dimension persisted long after 1945. The initial occupation of Germany was marked by the pervasive, intimidating presence of these massive soldiers. The non-fraternization rules, which were often broken, were initially enforced by men whose sheer size made them figures of undisputed authority. The German populace, conditioned by years of looking up to their own leaders and soldiers, now looked up to the victorious invaders. This visual dominance solidified the perception of total defeat and the impossibility of further resistance, accelerating the transition to a post-war order. In the long run, the lessons learned from the selective service data revolutionized American health and military science. It provided an unparalleled data set on the physical condition of an entire generation, over 18 million men examined, informing post-war nutritional policy, military training, and even the design of civilian clothing and vehicles. The GI's size became a national benchmark, a symbol of American resilience and resource wealth, forever linked to the image of the victorious conqueror. The story of the towering Allied soldier is a testament to how the mundane facts of civilian life, a child's daily milk ration, access to protein, and a stable industrial economy, can become the most potent strategic weapon. The war, for the German civilian, was lost the moment they realized the enemy was not merely an invading army, but an unending wave of men who seemed biologically superior, a living, breathing testament to the overwhelming power of their homeland. The laughter at the small Italian soldier was replaced by the silent, immediate terror of the Allied giant. The victory of 1945 was, in a profound and literal sense, a victory of the physically bigger, better nourished, and industrially sustained man. This hidden story of height and hunger remains one of the most compelling examples of how technological and economic systems ultimately determine the biological fate and the military outcome of nations at war. We have traveled from the Rhine crossing to the deepest psychological scars of occupied Germany, uncovering how a physical difference became a strategic hammer. If the untold stories of World War II, where biology meets strategy and human detail, unveils the grand narrative, captivate your mind, we urge you to subscribe to our channel and share this documentary. Help us continue to explore the hidden histories that truly define the greatest conflict the world has ever known.